What did it really feel like for the slave owners themselves when slavery ended? You don't usually hear that question out loud, do you? Well, you're about to find out how emancipation affected the people who benefited from it for centuries. The first thing you have to understand is the shock, the physical jolt that moved through their bodies when the news finally reached them. You can almost imagine the way their fingers tightened around their morning coffee cups, the way their eyes flicked to the windows as if expecting the landscape itself to look different. Because for slave owners, slavery wasn't just an institution. It was identity. It was economy. It was routine. It was the air they breathed. And suddenly, someone had announced that this air, this very oxygen, was no longer theirs by right. You can picture the sensory details, the humid southern mornings, where the sound of rustling leaves mixed with the quiet murmurs of enslaved people moving before sunrise. Except now, that morning carried a strange new tension. A mule's bray sounded sharper, a spoon clattered louder onto a breakfast plate, and if you'd been standing close enough, you might have noticed a tremor in a slave owner's hand as he lifted the newspaper that told him the world had changed. Originally, this moment wasn't supposed to feel so personal to them. They'd built everything on the belief that their world was unshakable. For generations, the system wrapped around them like armor. They'd looked at slavery as an economic certainty, an inheritance. The government had protected it, courts had reinforced it, churches had sanctified it. Every pillar of their society whispered the same reassurance. This will never end. But now, you compare that world to today, where the very idea of owning another human being feels physically nauseating to you, where you live in a time shaped by rights, laws, and the expectation of basic human dignity. And when you contrast that with how they live, you start to see why emancipation didn't just mean losing workers. It meant losing the mirror that reflected back the world as they believed it should be. So, let me ask you this. Can you imagine waking up one morning and discovering that the identity you treated as natural, even divinely ordained, was suddenly illegal, unacceptable, immoral in the eyes of the world? It makes you wonder how you yourself would react if everything you knew, your wealth, your status, your safety, were tied to a system everyone had abruptly declared dead. Then came the second wave, the financial collapse. You have to picture the sound of it, not in the loud crash you hear in movies, but in quieter details. The way ledgers no longer balance, the creak of empty barns, the uneasy silence in fields that used to buzz with forced labor. For slave owners, enslaved people weren't just workers. They were assets. They were collateral. They were lines on inventory sheets. In some regions, slave bodies were worth more than the land itself. You imagine a plantation owner running his thumb down a column of numbers, realizing they now meant nothing. It's almost like watching someone discover their bank account had been wiped clean while they were sleeping. The shock sits heavy in the chest. It's the kind of moment that forces a long, shaky exhale. Originally, the economic structure was brutally simple. Forced labor generated profit with nearly zero cost. Cotton, sugar, rice, every crop depended on bodies that could not leave. Slave owners took loans against enslaved people, used them as bargaining chips, and passed them down through families like furniture. Their entire wealth was built on human bondage. But compare that to today. You're used to wages, contracts, labor rights, exit options. If you hire someone, they can quit. They can demand fair pay. They can take you to court. And the value of your home or business doesn't come from owning another person. For you, it's unimaginable that someone's financial empire could hinge on the idea that another human being was property. But for them, when emancipation hit, their balance sheets collapsed overnight. Next comes the fear. You can almost taste the metallic sharpness of it. Slave owners had always lived with the unspoken knowledge that their safety depended on control, on violence, on hierarchy, on the constant threat that kept enslaved people from rebelling. And now, in the dim light of post-emancipation evenings, that fear sat in their throats like swallowed stones. You can imagine the sound of it. Doors being bolted earlier at night, voices lowered when discussing what might happen next, the shuffle of feet in hallways as people checked and rechecked windows, because slave owners knew exactly what they'd done. They knew the beating, the family separations, the whippings, the rapes, the forced labor. And now, these same people were free and nearby, and entirely aware of who had done what to them. Originally, the control system functioned like a machine, predictable, regulated through violence and structure. Every rule, every patrol, every punishment was designed to prevent revolt. But with emancipation, that machine broke apart, and slave owners, for the first time in generations, experienced vulnerability. Today, you live in a world where justice is handled by courts, not personal vengeance, where you lock your door out of habit, not fear of retribution from people you oppressed. That contrast makes you understand why some slave owners panicked. They were forced to confront a reality they'd pushed away for decades. You can't brutalize someone forever without wondering if one day they'll look back at you with their own judgment. So let me ask you directly, if someone you had wronged for years suddenly gained power and freedom, wouldn't a part of you wait, just wait, for the moment they might come knocking? But fear didn't sit alone. It brought its closest companion, denial. And if you listen closely, you can almost hear the tone of those private conversations, the ones whispered in parlors thick with cigar smoke, where slave owners tried to convince themselves that nothing had really changed. Because denial is loudest when the truth is unbearable. Imagine the smell of ink and parchment as slave owners drafted letters to neighbors, insisting their plantations would continue running as usual. Imagine the soft scrape of pen against paper as they jotted down plans that no longer matched the reality outside their doors. You can see them staring out across fields that once rippled with forced labor, convincing themselves that the people they'd enslaved would return out of loyalty. Originally, they wrapped themselves in elaborate myths to survive the cognitive dissonance. They told themselves they were paternal figures. They told themselves enslaved people needed them. They convinced themselves that the system wasn't morally grotesque. It was a way of life, even a positive one. But emancipation swung a mirror in front of them, stripping away every comforting illusion. And the more they tried to cling to fantasies, the more the world around them exposed just how hollow those fantasies were. So ask yourself, have you ever clung so tightly to a belief, one you knew deep down was slipping, that you convinced yourself it would return simply because you needed it to? Then came the bargaining, the kind that didn't happen with God, but with former enslaved people themselves. And you can imagine the awkward, heavy silence of those conversations. Plantation owner approaching someone he once ordered around, voice softening, offering wages that were barely more than insult, and the air between them thick with history none of them dared name out loud. Listen closely to that moment. You can almost hear the dry rustling of cotton still clinging to stems in distant fields. You can smell the lingering scent of soil, sweat, and sun-worn wood. You can feel the tension in the plantation owner's chest as he realized he had to say something unimaginable only months before. Would you stay? Originally, the South scrambled to reinvent the same system under new names: sharecropping, tenant farming, labor contracts written to trap freed people in cycles of debt. And every one of these new arrangements was a desperate attempt to reconstruct the economic advantage slavery once gave them. They needed labor, cheap labor, and they needed to maintain their sense of superiority. And then there were the ones who fled. You can almost hear the hurried clatter of trunks being dragged across wooden floors, the frantic packing done late at night. Picture the sharp scent of leather travel bags, the rustle of fabric as clothes were stuffed inside, the muffled panic pressing into every movement. These were the slave owners who believed freedom for black people meant danger for them. They believed their own sins were now headlights on a dark highway, exposing everything they wanted to hide. Originally, many families abandoned their plantations, moving west or even leaving the country. Some went to places like Brazil, where slavery continued for decades longer, hoping to recreate the world they'd lost. They carried with them their prejudices, their memories, and a strange sort of homesickness for a system built on cruelty. But compare that to the world you live in now. When life changes, you adapt, you pivot, you learn new skills. You don't flee to another nation to preserve a dying ideology. Yet slave owners weren't running from economics. They were running from a future they couldn't control, a future where they couldn't rewrite the rules, a future where they were no longer at the top by default. So ask yourself honestly, if everything that once guaranteed your status vanished overnight, would you stay and rebuild, or would some part of you want to run? Of course, not everyone ran. Some stayed and fought, but not in the way you think. Yes, there were violent resistors, people who refused to accept defeat and created paramilitary groups to terrorize freed people. But behind closed doors, a quieter, more insidious struggle unfolded. You can almost feel the thick tension in those community meetings, the ones held in dimly lit rooms where men huddled close, whispering plans to restructure society without technically breaking the new laws. Imagine the sound of boots scraping the wooden floor, the low hum of murmured agreement, the slow, deliberate writing of new rules designed to rebuild power under a different name. They couldn't own people anymore, so they built systems to control them: black codes, voting restrictions, labor laws designed to punish unemployment, laws that criminalized freedom itself. Originally, Reconstruction threatened to dismantle their world entirely. Black men held political office, schools were built for freed children, towns reorganized themselves, and for a brief moment, it seemed like the old order was gone for good. But the slave owners who stayed engineered new methods to maintain dominance. They traded whips for legislation, chains for bureaucracy, ownership for influence. When you look at today, you see the long shadows of those choices. Systems evolve, power adapts, and the past doesn't disappear just because the law changes. Then there were the ones who crumbled internally, the ones you never hear about. You can picture them sitting alone in dim rooms heavy with humidity, staring down at their hands with a confusion that felt almost physical. Men who had never cooked a meal, never plowed a field, never laundered their own shirts. Women who had never cleaned a floor, never raised their own children without enslaved caretakers. They were suddenly confronted with tasks they'd always outsourced to human beings they claimed were inferior. Imagine the sound of a man fumbling in a kitchen for the first time, the clang of metal pots, the smell of food burning because he didn't know how to control the flame. Imagine the awkward silence of a woman attempting to sew a torn hem, her fingers pricking with frustration. The sensory detail here isn't cruelty, it's irony. Their luxury had kept them ignorant. Originally, their entire social class was built around leisure. Plantation mistresses were trained in etiquette, not labor. Plantation masters were trained in management, not work. They believed they were inherently suited to leadership because they never touched the ground beneath them. Emancipation tore that illusion apart, revealing how unprepared they were for a world that expected them to live like ordinary people. So, when slave owners faced a life where labor was no longer something they could force onto others, many experienced something unfamiliar: humiliation. And here's the hook I want you to hold on to. What happens to a person when they discover their superiority wasn't a factor, it was a dependency. But the unraveling didn't stop there, because after the fear, the denial, the bargaining, the collapse, something else crept in. Something quieter, something they never expected: social isolation. Imagine the sound of chairs scraping across wooden floorboards as people leaned in close, trying to reconcile their new status with their old pride. People who once commanded rooms now found themselves ignored. People whose names once carried weight now felt that weight slipping. The plantation elites had built their identities on hierarchy, on always being the ones looked up to. But after emancipation, many found themselves looked at differently, even by other white Southerners. Originally, slave-owning families were the top tier of Southern society. Their wealth, built on stolen labor, gave them influence, connections, political power. Their homes hosted grand dinners. Their advice was sought by neighbors. But when emancipation hit, those same neighbors started whispering about mismanagement, overdependence, and ruined estates. The social blame quietly shifted. Families that once stood at the center of community life slowly drifted to the margins. Contrast that with your world, where status can shift but rarely disappears in a single stroke. You might lose a job, lose money, lose standing, but society has built-in pathways for reinvention. For them, reinvention was tainted with shame, because everyone knew exactly why their fortunes had collapsed. The illusion of respectability evaporated, and what remained was the uncomfortable truth. Their status had never been earned, it had been enforced. So here's the question that lingers like a candle flickering in a quiet room. How do you rebuild a social identity when everyone around you knows the foundation you stood on was stolen? But some didn't crumble. They adapted in ways that still echo today. You can almost feel the thickness of those conversations, the strategic ones, the calculating ones, held at long wooden tables under dim lamps. Men and women who realized that if they couldn't legally own black people anymore, then the next best thing was controlling the world around them. Picture the scratch of pen on paper as new laws were drafted. Hear the slow rumble of voices planning school boards, sheriff's elections, town councils. Smell the faint scent of tobacco as men sat back in their chairs, convinced they had found the loophole that would let them reclaim their sense of power. These weren't people adjusting to a new moral reality. They were engineering ways to reassert dominance. Originally, the end of slavery should have meant the end of that hierarchy, but Reconstruction, brief, fragile, and violently contested, revealed how far former slave owners were willing to go to preserve power. They used violence when they could, legislation when they couldn't, and social manipulation when both failed. They built segregated schools, restricted voting rights, and crafted economic systems that trapped freed people in cycles of dependency. Today, you're used to systems that at least pretend to aim for fairness, even when they fall short. But imagine living in a world where people openly redesigned society to maintain their advantage, and everyone knew it, but no one could stop it. Their power didn't vanish, it mutated. And here's the hook you need to hold in your mind. What does it say about a person? Not just that they lost power, but that they immediately set out to rebuild it at the expense of the people they had already exploited. For others, the psychological impact cut deeper than pride or fear. You can almost feel the hollow quiet in the bedrooms of plantation houses, rooms once filled with confidence and certainty, now heavy with dread. The same men who walked through their land with unquestioned authority now lay awake staring at ceilings, their minds twisting through the same thought over and over. Who am I without this? Imagine the creak of a bed frame in the middle of the night, the cold air pressing against their skin, the sound of someone breathing sharply as anxiety clawed through their chest. The disorientation wasn't random. It was physiological. Studies today show what we intuitively understand. When someone's identity collapses, the body reacts. Sleeplessness, rapid rapid heartbeats, loss of appetite. Their nervous systems were experiencing withdrawal from a lifetime of power. Originally, their sense of self was anchored in domination. They weren't trained to think of themselves as workers, equals, or even participants in a shared society. They were trained to see themselves as masters, providers, authorities, patriarchs. Emancipation didn't just take away labor, it took away the story they told themselves about who they were. Contrast that with your life. You've reinvented yourself at least once. Maybe you've changed jobs, lost someone important, been forced to adapt. Reinvention is part of modern adulthood, but for them, reinvention felt like annihilation. It meant admitting that the identity they cherished was built on cruelty, and some simply could not face that. So, I want you to consider this. How does a person recover when the version of themselves they believed in turns out to be built on violence and lies? And of course, there were the ones who doubled down on bitterness. You can almost hear the sharpness in their voices, the clipped tones at dinner tables where resentment simmered hot enough to taste, the smell of stewed vegetables or roasted meat hanging in the air as someone muttered that the world had gone mad. You picture the stiff posture, the tightened jaw, the simmering belief that they had been cheated by history. These were the people who refused to let go. The ones who believed they had been wronged simply because the world no longer permitted them to dominate others. You can hear the bitterness in the way they spoke, the sighs, the snorts, the grumbles. You can imagine the slamming of a newspaper onto a table when reading about freedmen voting. You can feel the tension in a living room where the mere mention of Reconstruction made the air vibrate. Originally, this bitterness wasn't harmless. It fueled political movements, violent groups, and community leaders who rallied around nostalgia for a world that never deserved nostalgia. They wrote memoirs painting themselves as victims. They erected monuments to rewrite their story. They passed their grievances down to children as bedtime lessons. So let me ask you directly, have you ever met someone who clung so tightly to their grievance that they reshaped their entire personality around it? But some experienced something unexpected, something you rarely hear in textbooks. You can almost feel the uneasy silence of private reflection, the kind that happens in moments when a person sits alone and finally confronts what they've done. Not every former slave owner sought revenge or reconstruction of power. Some felt shame. Not performative shame, not political shame, but the quiet kind that gnaws. Picture a man sitting on a porch at dusk, watching former enslaved people walking freely across land he once controlled. The sky above him bruised purple, the cicadas buzzing softly, the smell of damp earth rising in the air. And for the first time in his life, he sees not property, but people, adults with agency, families with dreams. And he realizes, perhaps painfully, what he stole from them. Originally, these moments of clarity were rare, but they existed. Diaries survive of slave owners writing about their guilt, their regret, their belated understanding of the horror they participated in. But reflection didn't free anyone, didn't repair the damage, didn't undo the crimes. Your world teaches you about accountability, therapy, remorse, growth. Imagine how foreign those concepts were to people who had lived their entire lives believing they were righteous, simply because society told them so. So I'll leave you with this question before we continue. What would it feel like if the truth you'd avoided your entire life finally caught up to you, and there was no one left to convince but yourself? And even after all that, the fear, the denial, the collapse, the shame, there was still the slow, grinding reality they couldn't escape. Life had to continue, and you can almost hear the heaviness in their footsteps as they walked across land that suddenly felt unfamiliar. For generations, that soil had carried one meaning, profit. But after emancipation, it carried another, labor, their labor. Imagine the morning after the last formerly enslaved family packed their things and left. The air hangs thick with the scent of dew on grass. Birds chirp somewhere in the distance. A wooden screen door creaks. A man steps outside and looks across a field waiting to be plowed, a field that used to bloom under the strain of stolen hands. Now the silence is unbearable. It's not peaceful. It's accusatory. Originally, plantations were designed around forced labor. Everything, the architecture, the schedule, the wealth, depended on an enslaved workforce. When that disappeared, slave owners faced a truth they had never considered. They were incapable of doing the work themselves at the scale their lifestyle required. Their mansions became burdens. Their land became liability. Their fields became a daily reminder of how much their power had depended on the suffering of others. Compare that to your life today. You're used to adapting, downsizing, changing careers, moving. But these families couldn't imagine a future that didn't look like their past. They weren't trained to evolve. They were trained to rule. So consider this. What does a person become when their entire world demands a form of survival they have never learned? And then came the generational fracture, the moment when children raised raised in the ruins of the old world, started asking questions their parents couldn't answer. You can almost hear the awkward silence at dinner tables when a son or daughter asked, "Why did we lose everything?" The parents swallowed truth like a hot stone and replaced it with myth. Picture the faint clink of silverware, the uneasy shifting of bodies. Imagine a mother looking down at her plate, avoiding eye contact, murmuring something about northern aggression or the way things used to be. Imagine a father stiffening in his chair, insisting the family had been wronged, refusing to admit the real reason, that their fortune was built on human bondage, and the world finally said no. Originally, the lost cause ideology didn't spring from nowhere. It was a story engineered around those very tables, a story designed to protect pride, not truth, a story that rewrote slave owners as noble, tragic figures instead of active participants in atrocity. Children absorbed it because it was emotionally easier. Parents taught it because the alternative felt like admitting they had lived as villains. So ask yourself, if your entire childhood was built on a story that protected your family's shame, how long would it take for you to question it? But while myths were forming in dining rooms, something else was happening outside, something far more visceral. You can almost feel the weight of dust rising under wagon wheels as families lost their land. You can smell the musty scent of auction houses as furniture was sold off piece by piece. You can hear the dull thud of a gavel as banks reclaimed properties that had been in families for generations. Because when the enslaved were freed, the wealth that slave owners had claimed as theirs evaporated. Many plantations fell into debt. Without forced labor, yields dropped. Without yields, profits collapsed. Without profits, estates failed. It was a domino effect, each fall louder than the last. Originally, slavery was not just a social system, it was the engine of Southern wealth. Insurance policies, loans, land values, political influence, all of it depended on the economic foundation that enslaved people provided. Once that foundation was removed, the Southern elite discovered their success had been built on sand. Look at your own life today. You know what it's like when the price of something changes, when a job disappears, when a market shifts. But imagine your entire region collapsing because one moral atrocity finally ended. Imagine watching your neighbors lose everything at the same time you did. Imagine the quiet despair of entire towns realizing that their prosperity had never come from ingenuity. It had come from exploitation. So here's the question that sits heavy. How do you rebuild an economy when its entire structure was designed around a crime? For some families, that question never found an answer. You can almost hear the slow decay in the creak of collapsing roofs, the wind howling through broken windows, the weeds swallowing the porches of abandoned mansions. These were the homes that once symbolized power, now stripped bare by neglect and time. Imagine walking through one of those houses years later. Dust swirling in sunlight, floorboards giving under your steps, a forgotten portrait hanging crooked on a cracked wall, a ledger on a desk, its ink faded, names of enslaved people listed like livestock, names that outlived the family that once claimed to own them. Originally, many plantation homes decayed because the families who owned them couldn't maintain them. Their wealth was gone, their influence gone, their labor force gone, their vision of themselves gone. History had passed them by, and all that remained were ghosts. Ghosts of a system that never deserved to exist. Contrast that with today, where ruins often fascinate people. But ruins like these aren't romantic. They're warnings. They remind you that no structure built on cruelty survives unchanged. They remind you that power borrowed from injustice never lasts. They remind you that history always collects its debts. But perhaps the most striking transformation wasn't physical. It was psychological. You can almost hear the internal monologue that haunted them in the years after emancipation. The voice asking questions they never had to face before. What if I was wrong? What if everything I believed about myself was a lie? What if the world I fought to protect was never worth protecting? Imagine living with those thoughts. Imagine how they pressed against the heart like a tightening fist. Some ignored them. Some drowned them in anger. Some buried them under myth. But some, just a few, let those questions in. And once they did, their world changed. Originally, the South did not encourage moral reflection about slavery. It encouraged silence. But the human mind knows its own truth. And there were former slave owners who spent their later years regretting what they had done, even wishing they had lived differently. Your world honors accountability, even if imperfectly. But imagine being raised your entire life to believe you were righteous, only to live long enough to realize you weren't. So let me ask you directly, how would you live the rest of your life if you finally understood that the world you helped build had caused suffering on a scale you never allowed yourself to see? And now we arrive at the part people rarely talk about, the aftermath that stretched into generations. You can almost feel the way stories were passed down, edited, softened, weaponized, reshaped. Former slave owners didn't disappear. They became grandparents, elders, storytellers, and the stories they told became the foundation of a culture that lasted a century beyond slavery's end. Originally, this is how entire regions developed selective memory. They didn't pass down truth, truth, they passed down nostalgia for a world built on human suffering. That nostalgia hardened into ideology. That ideology shaped politics, schools, monuments, culture. The legacy of slave owners didn't end when the Civil War ended. It seeped silently into the bones of the South for generations. Contrast that with the stories you grew up with. Stories that were likely edited too, just differently. Human beings protect themselves with narratives. They rewrite painful truths into manageable ones. But when a whole society does it, the impact lasts centuries. So ask yourself, what stories are you passing down? And which truths are you avoiding because they're too heavy to hold? But the real story, the one that matters most, is this. When a system built on cruelty collapses, the people who benefited from that cruelty face a reckoning. Some learn from it, some ignore it, some weaponize it, some crumble under it, but none escape it. And as you sit here listening, you can feel that truth settle around you like the final note of a long, winding song. History isn't abstract. It's human, it's personal, it's sensory, it's lived, and the echoes of what happened at the end of slavery still vibrate through the world you walk through every day. So before this moment slips away, let me ask you one last question. If the world you live in suddenly demanded you face the full truth of the systems that shaped your life, would you be ready? Thank you for watching this video. If you'd like to watch another fascinating video like this, click on one of the boxes on your screen right now.